Thank you for being here today. My name is Serhii. I'm the Vice President of the Ukraine House at Yale. And we're very excited to have today Professor Serhii Plokhy, who is the Mikhailo Khrushchevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and the Director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And he's going to be in conversation with Professor Arne Westad, who is the Director of International Security Studies and the Professor of History at Yale University. Professor Plokhy published recently a new book titled The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, which offers a distinct account and perspective on the war. And so today's conversation is really going to be centered around analyzing the origins of the war and trying to understand how that can kind of like guide us better in understanding the present moment of like what is happening here today. So we're going to explore the concept behind the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and to kind of like try to see where we can move on from that in the present moment. I'd like to thank Jackson School of Global Affairs and the Yale International Leadership Institute for co-sponsoring our event. And now please join me in welcoming Serhii Plokhy for a conversation with Arne Westad. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Well, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with Serhii Plokhy. Serhii is an old friend, colleague of mine, and he is also one of the most accomplished historians of international affairs I know of, not just in the field of Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe, that is his speciality, but he has also, in his work, touched on many other issues that are of great significance to international history, nuclear issues, not just your fantastic book on Chernobyl, but in a much broader sense than that, and also other international and global history issues. So it's wonderful to have you here, Serhii, that we could do this conversation. So the way I envisaged this was that we have about an hour and a little bit more perhaps for questions. I was thinking about doing it very much along the lines of your book. So in a way, thinking about the past, the present, and the future of Russia, Ukraine, the relationship between the two, and the global implications of that relationship. But since we are both historians, it's not unexpected, I guess, that we start with the past. And I think some of you were there as we were exploring in class this morning. The past history plays a really important role with regard to the origins of this war. I mean, not just history as experience, I mean, history that had developed in the time period, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, probably also deeper history than that, but also history as imagined by the two sides, right? So I wanted to start with that. I mean, it seems to me that in terms of the preparations for the Russian attack on Ukraine, you can almost follow this in terms of the thinking about history that is expressed not just by Putin himself, but by a lot of leading Russian politicians, thinkers who were closely allied with Putin. That there is a change there, there is a direction and line there that points directly towards the attack. Would you agree with that?
Let me think about that, whether I agree or not. I will, while I'm thinking, I want to thank certainly Zhenya Podgorets and student organization here at Yale for organizing this event, for inviting me. I want to thank also my dear friends, Marcy Shore and Tim Snyder and Arne you for coming and certainly helping with this event. So thank you very much. In terms of history as an interpretation of history and use and abuse and imagining history, please correct me if I am wrong, but I was thinking about the wars that I know something about and that I studied. I don't know any other war that would be wrapped so much in terms of its ideology into a particular region of history. So at least in my experience of studying war and international relations, this is quite unique. To a degree that the person who is probably most responsible for the war, Vladimir Putin, writing or co-authoring or editing or whatever it is essay on history of Russian-Ukrainian relations, not an essay on NATO,
exactly.
not an essay on the Russian-American relations, but on Russian-Ukrainian relations, and that's quite unique in its own right, in a sense of how much history matters. I maybe would go a little bit further even and be on more shaky ground, saying that that particular reading of history is, to a degree, also responsible for the Russian failures of the first year of the war. Because I think that the belief was sitting so deeply that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people, and the Ukrainians were just captured by the Nazis led by Volodymyr Zelensky, that also affected the planning of the campaign. Now, for me, and I started my transformation from early modernist into modernist by looking at the writings of Mikhail Hrushevsky and him deconstructing the Russian imperial historiography of the 19th, 20th century. For me, it was also striking how unoriginal the approach and the thought was that was presented in Putin's essay. Because what you see there, it's basically a traditional Russian narrative of history, where the Russian nation is imagined as a tripartite entity of Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians. And then when it was surreal, when I think that, okay, I recognize these things from 1860s and 1870s, but they are brought into the 21st century, not just as one of many ideas, as the only legitimate reading of the history, and on the basis of that is planned and executed the largest war, potentially probably, certainly the largest war in Europe since 1945, and maybe the largest war in the world since in the last 70 years. So that's what was shocking. The ideas themselves, they were pretty boring for me. I recognize them. What you see on the Ukrainian side is a complete refusal to understand what the guy is talking about, because it's a very different narrative that is at work. This is a narrative that is rooted very much in Hrushevsky's transformation of the history and historical understanding, where Hrushevsky and many people believed that the imperial vision of one big Russian nation really politically was destroyed in the revolution of 1917. And intellectually and ideologically was certainly destroyed through the writings of Hrushevsky and others. So that was more than 100 years ago. So how these ideas could come back? So it was the question also for many of historians like myself. How do you react to that? How you engage that sort of ideas, which you think, you believe, and most of the academia thinks are really passé, something that comes from the 19th century. And I think that this is a question how you deal with that, how you engage with the political abuse of history, is still very much. I don't know. At least for me, it's not completely resolved. I don't know exactly how to do that. I'm trying here and there, but
well, you're trying in your book in many ways. I mean, to set this right and to make it. I mean, one of the strengths of the book I find is that it's so eminently accessible in terms of your reflections on both on the history as lived experience, but also on the idealization of history that sort of comes out to some extent both on the Russian and the Ukrainian side, but in very different terms, right? But let's stay with Russia for a little bit longer with regard to this. So one of the things that has surprised me, shocked me most with regard to the war on the Russian side is the ease with which many Russians who know better, including some of our colleagues in Moscow, who certainly know better, have fallen in with the Putin-esque version of history, full knowing that among historians or anyone else who's been thinking about history, it hasn't really been alive for a very long time. But this conformity, this ability by people you and I know well, who've been interacting with Ukraine for a long time, know Ukrainian history as well as Russian history, to fall in with what the leadership demands has really shocked me. So I do a great deal of work on China. So China is an oppressive dictatorship in which it's really dangerous to go against some of the positions that are taken by the leadership, maybe particularly on historical issues, but people still do it. Historians still do it, knowing the kind of risk that they take in doing so. On the Russian side, you found very little of that, almost none. There would be sanctions against them, but some of these sanctions would be far less, in my view, at least at the beginning of the war, than what would be the sanctions for Chinese historians who stepped out of line. Why is that so?
I see that issue on two levels. The first one is that it's 30 plus years since the end of the Soviet Union, which is a big chunk of course, our lives, right? And on the other hand, historically, this is a really very small time, and we still live with the traditions that were established during the Soviet times, and that's basically also the tradition that you basically follow the line. In Russia, I don't think that anything of the sort that happened in Ukraine really happened, that the state was either too weak or too disinterested in history. That was in Ukraine for a long period of time. Historians were allowed just to go wherever you want to go. I don't think that ever happened in Russia. And in that sense, it's basically a Soviet tradition to really follow the line. And once you see that things change, then just follow that. And you were very careful not mentioning names. For me, the embodiment of this entire story is Chubaryan.
Yes.
A big person who became public during perestroika and really transformation of understanding, including of the Soviet history, international history. And then really you can look at his trajectory, and he follows what is happening in Kremlin. And he, for me, is really a figure that represents that trend and the largest part of Russian historians. On the other hand, there is also a thing that, again, Putin is not inventing that. Putin is not original. Putin is part of the process and entire generation which go after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They look for alternatives. And this is the story that is similar in Russia, in Ukraine, and anywhere else. You look for alternatives that are not communist, that are not Bolshevik or post-Bolshevik. And you find them in non-Soviet narratives, either before 1917 or emigre narratives. And when Ukrainians were doing that, most of them, what they were finding, Hrushevsky was not available, right? They find Hrushevsky. Some forms of liberal historical narratives. The radical nationalism certainly was present in Ukraine, but it never produced anything of worth kind of considering as a narrative or major historical work. So all of historical works or cultural work, a majority of it was created by this, in very broad terms, liberal Ukrainian intellectuals. When you are in Russia and you go and you look for the non-Soviet and anti-Soviet and other narratives, what you find is some form of imperialism. So that's already a tradition that goes deeper than just being subservient to the state and following the line that comes during the Soviet times. This is certainly, you reject Soviet narrative, you preserve the Soviet behavior vis-a-vis the state, using now this other imperial narrative. So at least that's maybe one way to start thinking about that. It's a big and very important question, and also I certainly feel that in you, and I share that it's also a personal disappointment to a degree.
It is, to a very high extent, I think. But let's pursue it a little bit further. So, Alexander Aganovich Chubaryan was, in many ways, during the Perestroika era, the one who began, though very cautiously, always a cautious man, to open up much of Russian historiography for involvement, maybe especially with former Soviet republics. I remember myself going together with him from Moscow to Kiev to participate, in a historical conference there. And I'm sort of thinking about this in terms of the imperial motif, which is also significant in your book in terms of how you develop your own thinking about where Russia is coming from in this conflict. And Chubaryan, again, is a good example of this because, as for those of you who do not particularly know this part of the world, his name immediately gives him away as Armenian. He's a Jewish Armenian. He doesn't necessarily connect very closely with a Russian identity at the sort of in the ethnic way that was always promoted in many ways during the Soviet Union. Still, he has embraced what is in effect a Russian imperial project, right? And as you said, a reinvented Russian imperial project. So I wonder if you could think a little bit about that, and you deal with this also in your book, but in a relatively brief form. When those who are behind the attack on Ukraine and the attempt to destroy Ukraine as an independent state, when these people who are associated with the current Russian Federation think about the kind of Russian world that they want to construct. I agree with you that the propaganda image is that they're all Russians. There is no difference between Russians, in their view, in Ukraine or in Belarus and in Russia itself. But could you pursue that line of thinking a little bit further? I mean, would it, for instance, be correct to say that for people like Chubaryan, since we now named him, even the idea of Russia is almost unimaginable without there being an imperial Russia? That there is that it's the imperial attraction in sort of self-definition that makes these remarkable turnarounds possible?
But there is this dimension, and I think about people coming to the empire from the periphery. Either it's Armenia, either it's Ukraine, or Baltic states, and
Georgia,
and it can be in a number of generations. But sort of keeping the empire alive, it's also to a degree justifying your own choice and your own being. So that's again speaking about the minorities and relation to the empire. Once they're at the center, they probably turn to be on many levels more imperial than others, because for them, and we now see that in Ukraine, and how many generals, not just with the Ukrainian names but with the Ukrainian background, are in the Russian armed forces waging this war in Ukraine. So that's certainly speaking about the minorities and empires. But other than that, my understanding of Russian imperial project is that I put a lot of emphasis on Solzhenitsyn, because for me he is in many ways formulated the vision and almost draw the maps that now the war is being waged not just ideologically, but also geographically. Because with Solzhenitsyn in 1990, he publishes How We Should Reconstruct Russia. So he is anti-imperial in a sense that he doesn't want to keep Georgia and Armenia and Caucasus and Central Asia. But he's thinking about the Russian nation as imperial because for him it's Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. How We Should Reconstruct Russia somehow includes Kiev, right? Somehow includes Lviv, and so on and so forth. So that's the imperial vision of the Russian nation. That's what became really the driving force behind this war. And then after 1991, Solzhenitsyn writes, okay, if it doesn't happen, if his plan is not realized, at least we should have Crimea and Donbass in distant Ukraine and Kherson. So you look at this map and you read Solzhenitsyn and it is there. So Russia is sort of in a post-imperial stage, but it's thinking about what is the core of the empire is very imperial, which is of course confusing, and I try not to talk about that when I am giving interviews for radio programs or something like that. But I think this is important part of the story. Other than that, it's more post-imperial project which you keep Russian control over the former imperial space in the form of the sphere of influence. In Ukraine, unfortunately, both models work, whether it's Eurasian Union and some form of keeping control over resources in the post-Soviet space, and the imperial vision of the Russian nation that also includes Ukraine. And that overlap is also partially background for this current war. So whether to give a short answer maybe to the questions that you asked, they think about the post-imperial future in imperial terms of the 19th century, which is again makes this so bizarre and almost difficult to believe into what they're saying and what is happening, and to take them seriously, right?
Right. I mean, we'll get to this hopefully a little bit later on, but for some of my Chinese friends like to make that point that, you know, Chinese these days sometimes find it hard to discuss things with Americans, but the Chinese would say at least we speak the same language. We speak 21st century language, while the Russians speak 19th century language, and that can sometimes be really hard to understand. Even if many of these people would like to sympathize with it, it's not easy to get, you know, from a 21st century perspective. Maybe as a segue over onto talking about contemporary affairs and leave a little bit of time to thinking about where we may go from here. So one of the big questions, I think, that connects the past to the present is whether Russia is imaginable without it being an empire, without it having an imperial idea at the core of it. Right? Because I think this was the problem that a lot of Russians who wanted to work on democracy, wanted to work on civil society, wanted to work on a more decentralized form of the state in the 90s and early 2000s, found that they came up against, right? Not in a sort of today's Putin form, you know, go off and attack and try to subdue Ukraine, but simply in terms of these somewhat mystical or mythical values of what it meant to be Russian that sets Russia apart. Now, I have argued before, not least in a session I did for Professor Snyder's class, that I see very strong similarities between some of this kind of thinking and what you found in Britain and France around the time of their own decolonization processes, where people gradually discovered that they couldn't do both. I mean, they could be a integrated democratic state, or they could be an empire, but they could not effectively be both, right? Particularly when colonized peoples then pushed back, as they would do in Algeria or Ireland or further afield. I see a direct connection between those difficulties and what happened in Russia. But where would you say that you stand now, Serhii, on this issue? I mean, if in the wake of losing the war in Ukraine, if Russians try to reimagine what their country might look like, is it possible to move away from an empire being at the center of it?
It's difficult, right? There is whatever history Russia has so far, it's basically some form of imperial history. You don't get in control 1/6 of the earth by being a nation state or proto-nation state. And Russia still is in charge more or less of 1/6 of the earth, right? So that's one of the imperial legacies.
Yes. Yes.
That is there and that they are trying to deal with. And the story that, okay, let's make Russia more European was certainly the one of the founding ideas of Gorbachev's perestroika. And more European meant introducing some elements of democracy. And once the elements of democracy are being introduced, the most mobilized force that emerges is basically the nationalism, different forms of nationalism in the periphery, and then mobilization of the Russian nationalism as always happens after that. So, which basically was very clear signal that, okay, if you want to continue to be as an empire, you can't be democratic. And the Yeltsin at that time draws line on the borders of the Russian Federation, but says, okay, Chechens are not living. So Yeltsin sends troops already there in 1991. He doesn't get too far, but he is trying to do that. So there is, and modern state, Russian state, in my opinion, is not born out of Gorbachev's mobilization and Yeltsin standing on the tank. The Russian modern state is born out of tanks firing at the Russian parliament in '93. It is born in the middle of the two Chechen wars. So it is the state that was born as an attempt to crush whatever elements of democracy were there and to maintain the imperial form of control. And we probably thought, okay, Chechnya is an exception. But it turned out to be that was the founding act of the creation of the new Russian state. So it wasn't the late Gorbachev's mobilization that leads to the formation of the foundations of the Russian state. It was the Yeltsin's constitution of '93-'94, destruction of the parliament, physically destruction of the parliament, and wars in the Caucasus, which continuation of the Russian imperialism, certainly coming from the 19th century. That's the foundation. So the Russian democracy also crashed on the rocks of empire. There were other rocks as well, but the imperial rocks were quite prominent and continue to be.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought of it quite in those terms before. I mean, both with regard to Chechnya and the destruction of Parliament, of Bielý Dom, which I experienced very close up. I was staying in an apartment in Krasnaya Presnaya just behind the Bielý Dom when they started firing at it. My windows came in, I remember. So I wonder if we could make the transition over to Ukraine then, in terms of changes and transformation. So one of the things that has struck me the most with Ukraine, and again, to be honest, somewhat surprising, is that the rapid transformation that Ukraine has gone through over the past 20 years, 15 years. When I first came to independent Ukraine in the 90s and the 2000s, it looked very much like Russia, right? I mean, it was an independent state, but in terms of how people thought about power, how they thought about their own participation in politics, what they complained about befell them as families or individuals, it was very similar to what you would find in Russia at the same time. And then, at some point, and I wouldn't be presumptuous enough to suggest a date, but you're an historian of Ukraine, Serhii, so maybe you would, there was a transformation that started, right? I mean, in a contested and problematic, as we know in Ukrainian history, but still a very significant part of the Ukrainian population, the Ukrainian youth maybe especially, started to move sort of in a different direction. So very often when we hear about this, we're thinking about, we're thinking about Maidan, we're thinking about 2014, we're thinking about the invasion and occupation of Crimea. But if you look at this in a more, perhaps in a slightly more structural sense, when did that turn start in Ukraine? That didn't happen in Russia. And what do you see as the main drivers for it?
Yeah, I think about the Ukraine of the first decade of independence as very much part of the Soviet Union that disintegrated, right? Ukraine was more than part of the Russian Empire, which is also very important, right? Regionalism was the factor that contributed to Ukrainian political pluralism to a degree that Russia didn't have. So in a sense, Ukraine was already not Russia in the 1990s. In Ukraine, there was a much less nostalgia for the what a great country we lost, right? Ukrainian elites gained something. They became presidents, they became ministers.
They gained a state of their own.
They gained a state, yeah. So, but there was a lot of confusion and little understanding of what that state was, because that state and that borders didn't exist maybe ever, or didn't exist for centuries, right? So the overused term in the 1990s was search for identity. Well, in Ukrainian case, it wasn't overused. It was maybe not conscious, but they were searching for the identity of this new group and this new state, which didn't have much of a history functioning as an independent state where decisions are made there in Kyiv, not in Moscow, not in Istanbul, not in Warsaw, not in other places. And they, it looks like, found themselves and found their voice in 2004, when the attempt was actually to take away from them the results of the election. That's where the mobilization happens. Suddenly it turned out that, as one of the participants and to a degree victims of those developments, President Kuchma said, Ukraine was not Russia. No, Vladimir Vladimirovich, you don't understand. Ukraine is not Russia. We can't do this or that. That realization that Ukraine was not Russia came already at the beginning of 2000s, after 10 years of this muddling through and trying to figure, okay, what did we get here? And that turned out to be a very positive thing in terms of the civic society, in terms of democracy, in terms of the institution building, because Ukraine moved in the direction of the basically late Soviet period and institutions. Again, the presidency, it's all Gorbachev era, the invention of Gorbachev era, but it didn't have that burden of state and state tradition, and especially imperial tradition for 300 years that Russians had. They were creating really something new. And that new turned out to be very, very different from Russia. Originally, they realized that they were not Russia, I mean elites, and then now the process of basically figuring out who we are is happening, and Europe, which traditionally was one of the poles with Russia in the Ukrainian identity, started to play much more important role, not just as an idea but also as an institution. I think it's in Russia we have the curse of the statehood, and in Ukraine you have the lack of state tradition came, of course, at a price, no question about that, but it also opened opportunities that Russia, I think, never had.
And that's, of course, reflected in the situation today. I mean, one of the things that has been most striking to me is how well Ukrainian polity, and of course supported by Ukrainian society, has held up under this onslaught. Because this is not just about what happens in the war is important, but it's also about what happens among civilians even away from the front line. I mean, this ability to be able to continue that process, which we agree was ongoing when the full-scale invasion actually took place, but seemed to have been deepened in many ways after, over the past 2 years after the full-scale invasion took place. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, this is not so much about identity as it is about institutions, I think. But do you think, sort of moving to the future a little bit here as well, do you think that the representative democratic institutions in Ukraine is something that's become so solidified before and during the war that they wouldn't be threatened by any kind of internal developments in Ukraine? I mean, I know you can never say never when it comes to political developments, but it seems to me that one of the most paradoxical effects of Putin's war is that it has entrenched democracy in Ukraine in a way that 20, 25 years ago would have been unthinkable.
Yes, I certainly see how the mobilization, it's an existential threat, right?
Right.
How mobilization really helps to really stress the sense of identity, but also in institutional terms, what is so different from Russia. Because if you have also on the front lines in eastern Ukraine, good part of the war on the Ukrainian side is fought in Russian. Good part or the majority of the Ukrainians basically are of the same religious tradition as the majority of Russians. So what are you fighting for? You're fighting on the Russian side. We discussed that. Okay, it's great Russia. It's empire in one imperial version or another, right? And it has a tradition. It has a basically very, very strong mobilizing potential. But what you are fighting for on the Ukrainian side? And you are fighting really for things like dignity, like freedom, democracy, the ability to choose our way of life, which is about democracy, right? So that's the symbol of faith that Ukrainians didn't have back in during the first decade of independence. They were still figuring out that they were not Russian, but what they're standing for. Now they are actually formulating the symbol of faith. And that's really would be difficult somehow to forget about that. That being said, what we already saw between 2014 and 2022 is certainly a creation of a much more unified Ukraine than it existed before. For the first time, you see the presidential elections, either Poroshenko or Zelensky, where the country is not split in half, which was the absolute norm during the first decades of the independence. You see absolutely unheard things since the times of the Soviet Union, where the communists were had a monopoly in the largest faction in the parliament that could control the parliament, with Zelensky's party having a majority in the parliament. So these are just visual things related to the electoral processes and what is happening in the parliament that happened after 2014 and created a very different political space in Ukraine from whatever was before. So the war, by definition, is a danger for the democracy. And especially when the country at the center is not, let's say, United Kingdom with a long tradition of democracy. But I remain at this point today still very optimistic about the Ukrainian democratic future. As a historian, I basically know that the biggest challenge for Ukrainians after 1991 was the challenge to learn how to live in a state of your own, how to domesticate the state. The Ukrainian national project was formed and survived in opposition to different states, right? So how do you embrace the state? And Ukrainians are managing to do that now, but there is, you can't just write off 200, 300, 400 years tradition of still being suspicious of the state. And that is a factor that is there. The war, which is basically very much formulated in Ukraine in terms of the defense of democracy and dignity and the possibility to make a choice, it's another factor. And the third one, that it looks like there is a consensus in Ukraine that future of Ukraine is in Euro-Atlantic structures and in the European Union, which is a very particular club where you can join it only when you are, at least on some level, can fit the model of what is a democratic state. So there is also incentive to keep these democratic institutions and traditions. As you said, never say never. Things can change, but I see very powerful forces, both historical but also geopolitical, that are at work today to solidify and save and solidify Ukrainian democracy.
It's remarkable in many ways how sort of majoritarian imperial pursuits can produce, among peoples who are closely connected to the center of the empire, ideas about a very different kind of state structure and political structure. So I was in Taiwan for the first time in almost a decade, when I was in China a few weeks ago, and I met with the president of the Kuomintang party, so the founding party of the Republic of China, and the ones who took over in Taiwan after 1945, and introduced what in many ways was a state that in its assumption of total power were very similar, though in opposite directions, of what the communists did in the mainland. I mean, it was for its inhabitants a dangerous dictatorial state. So I met with the president of the current Kuomintang and I asked him what was most important for him now in Taiwan's relations with the mainland. And he said, without any hesitation, Taiwan democracy. Right, so I have the president of the Kuomintang say that is the #1 priority in dealing with China. Tells us something, I think, about these trajectories, right? In terms of how things can change in a somewhat unexpected direction and avenue. So I'm going to open up for questions from the audience, Serhii, but just one final question along these lines. So for the people of Taiwan, the biggest challenge is how do they protect that democracy? How do they protect the form that their island's government has from what is likely to be increased pressure, possibly an attempted war of occupation by the mainland? When you look at Ukraine today, going forward in this war, what do you see on the Ukrainian side, both in terms of priorities set by the Ukrainian government with regard to the war and with regard to relations with Russia, but also for Ukraine's own inner development. But you said a minute ago, and you put it very eloquently, that the relationship to the European Union is obviously going to be of enormous significance for Ukraine, as, in my view, Ukraine is for the European Union. So this is something that goes both ways. But how do you see that immediate future?
There can be a number of immediate futures. I guess if you would have this conversation immediately after I finished writing the book, or even when it was published, I would be talking about one future and one future only. Now we know that we are facing a long war. We don't know whether the Western support would continue and would continue on this level or not. So the possibility of not just stalemate, but outright loss in this war by Ukraine and by its allies is a possibility. And that means that there are different trajectories that we have to seriously consider. But my understanding generally of the impact of this war, whatever its outcome is that first of all, the peace dividend of the fall of the Berlin Wall has been spent, so we are in a different place completely. And that whether there will be another Iron Curtain or not, and who will build it, it's a question. But I don't see really the gray zones in Europe surviving as the result of this war. So Ukraine can be either on one side of divide or on the other side of divide. And these are very different futures. These are as different futures as the post-World War II history of Eastern and Western Germany, or central part, which was within the sphere of the Western occupation, and eastern part of Europe that was under the sphere of the Soviet occupation. So that's, in terms of historical parallels, that's the closest thing that comes to my mind. That's probably will be the sort of the division, and very different futures. The integration into the Eastern, integration into the Western structures means that Ukraine will survive and potentially there will be development and potentially it will be flourishing, not flourishing together with its neighbors in the West. Integration into the Eastern structure, I draw this parallel with Germany. It will be not Germany, it will be not Vietnam, it will not be Korea, because Ukraine will perish. Because whatever was happening in all these cases, the Soviet Union never claimed that Eastern Germans are really Slavs or really Russians. What we see on the occupied territories in Russia is basically complete destruction of any Ukrainian cultural element and an element of Ukrainian identity or whatsoever, linguistic and otherwise. So it is a destruction of nation and national identity, and it's clearly articulated and formulated goal of the 19th century Russian Empire that they couldn't achieve. Really a big Russian nation. So it's not Russian control over Ukraine, it's complete destruction of Ukraine. That's what actually denazification really, the real meaning of denazification is. So this is strikingly different futures to a degree that in one case Ukraine exists and develops, another it just stops stops being on the map of the world.
Let us open up for some questions from the audience if you have any. And if you can introduce yourself and just stand up so we can hear you. Start over there.
Good evening.
And shout, because acoustics in here are awful.
Good evening. I'm beyond grateful to be here. I'm Veronica. I'm a junior studying at Cornell University. I'm double majoring in political science and performing in media arts. I'm from Ukraine, Kyiv. So speaking of political abuse of history, I think of this question a lot. It's about archives and the way they were destroyed or hidden. And I just wonder, what are the ways to get access to St. Petersburg or Moscow archives that hide so many information about Ukrainian culture and history? And my second question is about imperialism and the fact that because we are a post-Soviet country, we have this syndrome of inferiority. And I do believe that Ukrainians went far away from that, but what are the mechanisms that would help us to move even forward? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on the question of archives, and my answer, first part of the answer may sound cavalier, but I just don't see any other really long-term solution. The only way to get to the St. Petersburg and Moscow archives is defeat Russia in this war, produce conditions for the transformation of the Russian society. We can talk about other things, but that's very difficult to achieve, but that's the only solution that I see. So the question of the archives for now, until what I suggested has not happened, or whether it will happen, is that we got a unique opportunity. It's a blessing in disguise to now work in the regional archives. I mean, regional of the former empire and of the former Soviet Union, and for historians really to rewrite the history, imperial or the Soviet history, to rewrite it from below, because it was too easy maybe to go to Moscow and to work with the central archives and everything is there. It's much more difficult to go like my students are doing now between Chisinau and Vilnius, but it will be a very different history. So no question, it's a problem, no access to the central archives. But the access was there and was perceived to be the only way to write the history for so long that having a couple of years, a couple of decades, focusing on archives in Tbilisi, in Almaty, or somewhere else, this is an opportunity forced on us, but we should embrace it. In terms of Ukraine and the sense of inferiority, right? That's how I understood it. Ukraine was always it certainly had this sense, and it was there of sort of second-rate, whole and uneducated, and Ukrainian language is a language of the lower classes. But it started changing and shifting, and especially after 2013 and 2014, and it's my understanding is, and it's a little bit anecdotal evidence, looking at the Facebook, looking at other, it's basically the younger generation who made a choice of switching from Russian to Ukrainian. And you probably hear this again and again, and you're just already sick and tired of saying that, okay, you're our future, the future belongs to you. Well, I can say this is actually true. So whatever you decided to do, that will define the future, and then your children will come and they will define future ahead. So, but at least for now, you're the masters of the situation. So what is happening in your milieu now? It's maybe is perceived to be marginal today, but it will become the mainstream. It will become the mainstream tomorrow. The sense of inferiority will very much depend on its future, will very much depend again on the way how this war will end. I keep coming back to that's the issue that is on the agenda. And this is the issue on the agenda not just for Ukraine, for the future of Ukraine, for the future of the world in general. I already mentioned the largest war in Europe since '45, potentially the largest since Korean War in the world. It matters how the wars of that proportions end. It matters. You can't just hide and run away. It just forget on whose side who is. The wars of that proportion, they shape the future for a good part of the world, maybe the trajectory of the world as a whole for some period of time. So the war lost would certainly reinforce whatever elements were there certainly before 1991, especially before 1991 of some sort of inferiority complex. Yeah.
It would be ironical, wouldn't it, if the war is what leads to decolonizing Russian history. I mean, in a way, by seeing it from elsewhere. I mean, to some extent, you could say that that's what's happened after most Chinese PRC archives were closed down, that much of Chinese, certainly 20th century Chinese history, started to be rewritten from the periphery, which was probably a good thing in many ways. Not that I would recommend the closing of archives, but I think sometimes changing your place of view does have an impact on how you understand the whole imperial formation and what it has led to. Let's see, anyone over here? No? Yes, Tanya?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Tanya. I'm a student here at Yale, and I'm from Ukraine, Ukraine. And my question also has something to deal with the politicization of history. And in particular, I'm wondering how you as a historian deal with the troubled parts of Ukrainian history that are now being taken to extreme and weaponized and extremely politicized by Russia. Because from my own experience, both in academic setting and in personal conversations on campus, it's really easy to debunk this myth about how Putin and Russian politicians are talking about that Ukraine is governed by Nazis. You just give people like statistics and facts. The same goes for this alleged fictitious genocide of Russian speakers in Ukraine. Again, you just give people facts. And I find it easy to talk about that, but it gets much harder to talk about like Bandera and Ulupa and Volhynia massacre and Lviv pogroms. Because there you have to always keep this balance. You are trying not to sound too apologetic, because obviously anti-Semitism and Bandera's biological nationalism had a lot of abuses. But you're also trying not to sound like a Russian propagandist, because you understand that it's not the whole history. And that was just, I think it comes to the point where you're trying to distinguish like real historical facts and people's perception of it, of those facts now, because again, it's all complicated and it takes ages to explain to people who are not, who have not been studying Ukrainian history. So yeah, I was just wondering, as a historian, how do you proceed with depoliticizing history and being honest with historical facts without succumbing to radical rhetoric on either side?
Thank you.
That's an important question.
We are in the middle of the war, and our autonomy as historians is really questioned and threatened, because this is the period of the simplistic narratives that are being pushed by different sides. When I am given interview, the interview is related to the book and it's on contemporary, but either it's people who sympathize with Ukraine or not, there would be a Bandera would be there, and there would be discussion about that. And this is basically a diversion, right? This is a diversion. Again, it's a very politically motivated angle, that the discussion of what happened yesterday in Kharkiv or in Kherson somehow goes back to and you spent good part of your interview on that. So it is a challenge of how you yourself, in that sense, don't become a propagandist and circling the wagons and defending whatever narrative that you didn't even produce or invented, but that's okay. These are your three choices, yeah. Right? That exist there, and the three lines of questioning, and then you take one of them. So salvation is basically, again, in this really professionalism and placing things in the context of the time and talking about them honestly. And another thing is talking about, because all these questions are formulated through the position of today, talking also about the transformation of the society. We talked about the Ukrainian society of 91 is different from 2013, and then what is now, it is changing. And I assure you it is very different from the one of 1943, right? And that change and that transition and transformation of the society, that's what is important. The questions that for me are important as an academic, or really puzzling or interesting, is how, given all the story of 1943 and 1944, how do we have the phenomenon that Professor Snyder in his testimony suggested, that the Ukrainian radical nationalist parties are not present in the parliament, right? I can push further. How does Ukraine have the only president of Jewish background outside of Israel? The place that otherwise, according to particular narrative, it's the birthplace of pogroms. Pogroms, yes, but let's talk about this transformation. So the question is not really denying or distorting certain things, but being honest in assessing the history, but also putting history in the broader perspective, because all of these debates and discussions and these questions are formulated by today. So so going into the past but returning to the context of today is very important for me.
So we're very lucky at Yale that we have Professor Shaw and Professor Snyder who can inform us about these things. So we have you, Serhii, right up the road. But not everyone is in that kind of position. We had a conference here in ISS a few weeks ago on Africa and Ukraine, which is the first time I ever heard the term Afro-Banderist used, which shows how pervasive Russian propaganda can be. And this was against a Ghanaian friend of mine who happened to know something about the situation in Ukraine and in Russia, speaks fluent Russian. But that pervasiveness is very striking. I mean, it's very significant. The one over here, yes.
My name is Julian. I'm a sophomore studying ethics, politics, economics, and history.
Speak up further, Julian.
So my question is, should the United States prioritize Western integration of these gray states or prioritize creating a buffer zone of political neutrality?
Yes, I think that U.S. prioritized. First of all, the U.S. has a lot of influence in the world, but U.S. more often than not reacts to what is happening in that world, rather than defining the direction. So that being said, almost by default, the U.S. was working within the paradigm of the gray zones for 30 years, right? And that gray zone was shrinking, but eventually there was a consensus, I guess, both in the European community and in the US, that there will be some gray zone, and that this is a good thing. And now we know that unless the gray zone has nuclear weapons like Ukraine had before 1994, gray zone is basically another term for the area of the vacuum of power, which sucks in the imperialist-minded countries and basically the power. The power relationship in the world are formed in the way that becomes the area of the next confrontation. We are having this largest war in 70 years in the gray zone. So if this is not an indication that gray zone is a major problem at this point in Europe, then I don't know what other formulations you want to have. So again, I think that the idea is that probably these gray zones disappear. US is part of that process. I don't think that US really decides. Again, but by offering support or not, it can certainly influence the situation, but it's not the US that just decides what. Or just US, the power that decides what will be there or will be in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here. I'm here on behalf of Brave Generation NGO. I'm Serhii. I study economics at the University of Alberta, Canada, also one of the biggest places of Ukrainian community in North America.
Indeed.
And I come from Donetsk, and so in 2014 I could witness firsthand how Russian proxy war works. And even though I was a kid, what truly impressed me is this obsession with like physical power, because people that were in Donetsk, they were like proud of like, okay, we put roadblocks next to city council. We are proud that we are riding tanks right now with Russian flags. And before invasion 2022, I was 100% sure that the war wouldn't happen, because I thought I went bet $20 with my friend. Because like I thought, well, there is digital warfare, there is proxy war, there are like trade wars, right? How could a state like Russia just physically attack Ukraine in the 21st century? And my question to you is, why do you think they are so obsessed with physical possession of other regions and like weapons and all this like kind of symbolics of like power? Thank you.
Is it because they speak 19th century language and that now comes back to haunt us?
Yeah. In my book, I have the one sentence where I'm saying that this is a 19th century war in terms of ideology, a 20th century war in terms of tactics, the battlefield in 21st century in terms of technology. And you have that all together. Well, I can tell you that for me as a historian, this war and the way how it waged, in particular on the Russian side, explains so much about the history of the 20th century. Suddenly I realized on so many levels how the Red Army and the Soviet Army was fighting in the war, in the Second World War. The issues of the really disregard for human life, not just of the occupied territory or of the enemy, but of your own soldiers. It was a déjà vu, and I realized that, okay, very little change on that basic level, cultural level in the society for almost 100 years. And that leads me to formulate the answer to your question, that I think it's the Russia turned out to be not only unreformed ideologically, but also in terms of thinking about the wealth and the control. There was a period, again, we talked that imperialism was part of the Russian history and Russian approach. There was a period where Chubais, at the beginning, who was one of the Tsar of privatization and certainly had influence with Putin early on, had this idea of the liberal empire. So basically controlling of the post-Soviet space through the economic influence and financial and so on and so forth. And eventually it failed, and it turned out to be military and brutal force, the only instrument that Putin had. And it worked, again, it brought back ideologies, it brought back the approaches, and it brought back culture. So Russia is really, the way how it fights this war demonstrate that it was really not developing, or if it was transformed by the 20th century, it was transformed in the way that reinforced some deep-seated cultural models and paradigms. And again, it's about the control of the territory. And it doesn't matter, we'll destroy Mariupol, the population can be killed, can live, doesn't matter, we control the territory. And that's very much 19th century thinking, and they're still there. The problem for many other countries is actually, well, maybe we don't want people. Maybe we want people, and that's how the immigration is being managed or mismanaged.
Yeah.
But that's the capital, but not the territory itself, unless this is a control over the oil resource or something. But it's not how Russians are thinking, and that going back to the Chinese think that they're a little bit old-fashioned.
Yes, indeed. Well, Professor Plokhy and I could sit up here discussing this all afternoon, but I promised that we would finish this sort of not too long after 2:15. Serhii, it's always such a tremendous pleasure to see you and to talk with you. Thank you so much for coming here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.